Greetings, everybody. I am Rob Bernstein, launching a new podcast over with Zero Hedge, and I am honored to be joined by David Stockman. I am a regular reader of the Contra Corner. The Great Deformation was one of the greatest books I've ever read in my life, and so it is a pleasure to have you as my first guest. Well, welcome, Mr. Stockman.
Glad to be with you, and it couldn't be more timely. I mean, we've in the last 24 hours, we've had some real atmospherics, let's say, on the whole issue of really economic policy, fiscal policy, where the country's going, what Trumponomics is all about. We're right at the, baseline of the whole thing.
Well, we can hop in right there, but from reading the Contra Corner, when you say what Trumponomics is all about, do you think there's some cohesive philosophy there in which he's working with, or what do you think the Trumponomics that he's working around actually is?
No, I don't think there's anything cohesive, coherent, consistent, historically grounded, or theoretically logical about it. I think it's just a dog's breakfast of observations, prejudices, seat of the pants theories, and impulses that he's picked up over the years and responds to in a very glandular way, without much information and without much thinking. And so it's not going to work. It's going to end up being a demolition derby. He's wrong about protectionism. He's wrong about big, beautiful tariffs. He is missing the boat entirely on fiscal policy. You know, when you look at what they're dealing with down there on the next 10 years, just the baseline, what CBO says will happen if we have no change in policy and a kind of a strong full employment economy as far as the eye can see. If we have that, you will generate 22 trillion of additional debt over the decade on top of the 37 trillion we already have. But more importantly, that 22 trillion assumes that all of the 2017 tax cuts expire as they do under current law. That's the logical way to look at it. That's the convention, for budget forecasting. And now, they're trying to tell us, well, it doesn't really, this plan, the one big beautiful bill, isn't the abomination that Elon Musk said it was yesterday. He nailed it because, the tax law is just being extended. Well, okay, if you're just extending existing tax law, if you want to look at it that way, then what we have is about 89 trillion of spending built in over the decade. And we have about 62 trillion of revenue if the tax cut, were allowed to expire. So, that's 27 trillion of debt. And they're doing not a damn thing about it. There's some minor cuts in Medicaid, some kind of token cuts in food stamps. And the rest of it, all of these big entitlements are given a free pass. So the whole thing makes no sense. Not the trade policy, not the fiscal policy. The worst part of it is the immigration policy. We desperately need entry-level workers, low-skill workers, because the native supply of workers is dried up. The babies weren't born. They're not there. And so if Trump's now going to come in and deport millions of them, through roundups at workplaces, we're going to have a third dimension to this problem, and that is a severe labor shortage. Now, how that adds up to what he calls a new golden age of economic prosperity is beyond me or anybody who's got some historical knowledge and understanding of the big picture economically.
So we laid out a couple of different things there, which includes the tariffs, the deportations, but let's stay on the big, beautiful bill for one moment here.
Sure.
So Donald Trump attacked Rand Paul yesterday. I'm going to read his tweet. He said, Rand Paul has very little understanding of the BBB, especially the tremendous growth that it has coming. He loves voting no on everything. He thinks it's good politics, but it's not. The BBB is a big winner. Can you take on Donald Trump's claim here that the BBB will somehow lead to economic growth?
Well, I don't know how it can, because the only thing it does is extend tax cuts that are already in place. So we can look at the period from 2017 December, when the original Trump tax cut was adopted, through 2024, and we see that the economic growth rate was subpar. It was barely 1.6, 1.7% annually. Now, if you're simply going to extend what you already have, and you have a track record that proves it doesn't lead to any, explosion of growth, I don't know. He's just making it up. Trump makes up anything that sounds good, that seems like a justification. The fact is, it's going to make the economy worse, not better, because this built-in debt is going to be compounded or added to, as I just said, by $27 trillion over the next 10 years. So now, what I think Trump doesn't understand in the slightest is that our economy is being crushed by too much public and private debt already. And by that, I say not just the 37 trillion of federal, but if you take the household debt, which is over 20 trillion, business sector debt, which is also over 20 trillion, financial sector, the total debt on the US economy is 102 trillion. And so therefore, the economy is lugging around a debt burden like has never been, experienced before. It obviously is a growth retardant. Growth, it represses growth. And now we're in a situation where if interest rates rise even by 1%, and that's easily could happen because it has constantly over time, that will add a trillion a year of interest expense to the US economy on top of what's already there. So, we have an economy that's in big trouble, and this one big beautiful bill only makes it worse.
So on the topic of Trump just making things up, I think that's partially his brilliance from a marketing standpoint, is that he's clearly able to sell himself to the American people. The Trump loyalists get behind him. It's always 4D chess. So one of the sales here is people seem to really like the idea of a growth in U.S. manufacturing, of a time that I guess you can just show up to a factory, get on the line, and work a job. And you were saying that the current debt levels in our country are kind of the retardant on growth. What is, in your opinion, what has gotten rid of American manufacturing, and is it important for America to even being manufacturing goods?
Well, actually, I think he's right on the offshoring of our industrial economy, the loss of millions of manufacturing jobs and related jobs, but he's totally wrong as to the cause. The cause is not as foreign suppliers are cheating, or foreign governments are nefariously engaging in unfair trade practices. In fact, if you look at our average tariffs and those of the EU or of China or of the Eastern Pacific exporters like South Korea, Taiwan, etc., our tariffs are as high as theirs. Our non-tariff barriers are as significant of theirs. One of the big non-tariff barriers allegedly is governments subsidize their exporters, their manufacturing industry. Well, the biggest subsidizer of industry in the world is the Pentagon, $1 trillion budget, several hundred trillion that go to purchase R&D as well as procurement. All of that, gives an advantage to our manufacturers and to some degree our tech firms. So there's nothing to the whole charge that we're in a battle with the rest of the world because they're cheating and we're going to win back what is rightfully ours. That's just Trumpian rhetoric. It's nonsense. There's no factual basis to it. It's something he's been saying since the 1970s because that's what he believes. And remember, one of the things about Trump is that he's fact-free when it comes to the positions that he takes. So what's the real cause, ironically, is our costs are way too high, and that's a function of the Federal Reserve. If you look at China today, their fully loaded manufacturing wage is about $10 an hour, and that's benefits, taxes, and pay. It's $40 an hour on average in manufacturing here, so it's 4 to 1. If you look at Mexico, it's $40 here and $5 there. So the problem is our costs are way too high, and they got too high over decades and decades of the Fed pursuing a pro-inflation policy. I've been at this for a while, and I can tell you in the 1970s or even 1980s, there was no view that said, oh, we got a deficiency of inflation. We're not getting enough inflation. We need the central bank to print more money and fuel a higher inflation rate. That's crazy. That is a policy that's late in coming. It was really adopted by Greenspan for whatever reason I can't figure out after 1987. And so we basically priced ourselves out of the world market. 2%, 3%, sometimes 4% inflation year after year after year, compounded and resulted in a cost structure that was just uncompetitive in the world market. And so we basically lost manufacturing business, both export-wise and in terms of the flood of imports, because our costs were too high, we couldn't compete. Now, the irony of this is Trump is always attacking, as he has exactly today, attacking the Fed for not printing enough money, for not pushing interest rates low enough, for not putting enough artificial stimulus into the economy of the very kind that's produced the cumulative inflation that's priced us out of the world market. So he's not only off base, he's got it ass backwards in many fundamental ways, and certainly with regard to manufacturing. Sure, I would like to see a lot of manufacturing come back, and the only way you're going to do it is put the Fed on a diet where they don't print any more money, and we allow the price level to at least begin to stabilize rather than continue to rise. And maybe eventually you can become a little more competitive, but you're not going to do it with tariffs. If you look at the so-called Liberation Day tariff, and I'm glad the courts are stepping in. I'm not for the courts, making policy in general, but the abuse of the so-called Economic Emergencies Act. It was passed in 1977. I was actually there, and I was worried the other day, did I vote for that damn thing? Because it's an open-ended, delegation of power to the president to tax the economy literally by trillions of dollars, as we can see from all these so-called reciprocal tariffs. So I had to go back, to the congressional record and check it out. And sure enough, I didn't vote for it, nor did anybody else. Why? Because it was passed by voice vote on this under a suspension of the rules. In other words, it was considered so much of a unimportant ministerial codification of emergency powers that then existed. It had been used in real crises from time to time, that it didn't even have a recorded vote. Now, on the basis of that happenstance, and I would say reckless, unconstitutional delegation of open-ended taxing power, we have a madman in the Oval Office right now that proposed the following. If you look at the reciprocal tariffs on each part of the world, Canada, Mexico, the EU, Japan, South Korea, China, and the 145% tariff on China, and you apply those rates, which I have, and it's in the stuff I publish every day, to the current level of imports, which is about 3.3 trillion a year, you get an average 30% tax, a $1 trillion tax based on taxation without representation. The thing, if I'm not mistaken, that started this whole process in 1776. So we've got a real rogue administration in the Oval Office using open-ended, improperly delegated powers to massively tax and disrupt the U.S. economy, like things that people couldn't even imagine 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. So where this goes, I don't know. But I can say that when you put together a dog's breakfast of everything that's wrong, tariffing, money printing, borrowing, spending, and then even increasing the defense budget to $1 trillion, which is 2 times more than we actually need, you have a prescription for a demolition derby. So that is, it's not a big, beautiful, one big, beautiful bill. It's the most god-awful demolition derby that has ever been presented by, a president. So, we're heading, I think, for some very rough waters. And we're almost there. Because what happened in the last day or two, this attack on Rand Paul is beyond belief, okay? Rand Paul defended Trump over and over and over on Russiagate, on the J6, on the weaponization of the machinery of justice. Rand Paul was, the most eloquent, steadfast supporter he had, and yet he tells Trump the truth that this bill is not what it's cracked up to be. It's not what they told you it is, and there's no way I'm going to embrace raising the public debt ceiling by 5 trillion. And Rand Paul told him that, and he's right. And Trump went off the deep end and just let loose with all these epithets that he published yesterday. And then on top of that, a few hours later, you get Elon Musk coming along and saying, I can't justify this anymore. It's a god-awful abomination. And, in some ways, I can sympathize with Elon Musk because he gave it a yeoman's effort. He gave it a real college try, as they say. He finally figured out that all the money he thought was being saved wasn't being saved at all, because unless you have a rescission bill that cancels the budget authority under the 1974 Impoundment Act, you got to spend it, or the court will make you spend it. So you can cancel a bunch of these dumb foreign aid projects, or you can cancel spending at the public broadcasting system, but you're just going to have to spend it on something else that is probably equally bad. So he finally figured out we need rescissions. And after all of this atmospherics, after all of this, wasteful fraud, waste, and abuse fireworks, they barely came up with a rescission bill yesterday that is about $9 billion. I mean, it's a rounding error. It's a joke. And so it was like a big middle finger to Elon saying, okay, thanks for the effort, and here is a $9 billion joke, instead of actually doing something about, this $8 trillion per year budget that we have. So Elon let loose, and I think I sort of felt that way in 1985 when I finally had to leave the Reagan administration. The deficits were soaring. And I finally said, well, I can't justify this anymore. I can't rationalize it. I can't front for it. And I think maybe in some ways that's what Elon did yesterday. But it was the, warning bell in the whole process. Because I think the OBBBA, One Big Beautiful Bill Act, is dead on arrival. It will never get through the Senate after this. It's going to be cut to shreds and smithereens, and then we're going to be in a very bad way, because I think Trump will lose it entirely, and he'll be charging around the Oval Office, and his big fat fingers will be poking away at his keyboard, denouncing everybody and their brother, by the hour, as this thing falls apart. So you had the big 3-month-long honeymoon where all kinds of stuff was happening, and there were fanboys, Trumponomics fanboys, who found some logic and some benefit in all this. But now it's clear it was just a lot of motion that's leading to what I call a demolition derby.
Well, I love the clarity on that. It's just terrible in your opinion. Also, I can be a little bit stone-faced when I'm concentrating, but I'm picking up what you're putting down. Cutting in here for a sec for a quick ad read. Listen, we're talking about some spooky stuff, and you want to make sure that you're prepared for anything. You do that by having your own power. If you want to be one of these people, you want to go live out naked in the woods, or if there's a power outage, you want to be the one person on the block whose television is still running, the air conditioning still going, and you're comfortable within your house, don't rely on this electricity grid. We know what Biden did with all those windmills. We know what happens when there's storms. We know what happens if you're living out in liberal California. You want to be self-sufficient, and you want to make sure that you've got energy no matter what? Well, what you need is the Grid Doctor 3300 solar generator from My Patriot Supply. This guy right here, it's an absolute beast. 3,300 watts of off-the-grid power that can keep your fridge, freezer, lights, even medical devices running when the grid power fails. And guys, crazy deal here. Crazy deal. You see those 2 solar panels behind the device? They're throwing that in completely free. That's an $894 value. And let me tell you guys, they're not cheap plastic either. These things are super durable. They're going to last through storms. They're going to last through heat. Whatever the elements throw at you, if you want to live off the grid or just be the one guy who doesn't have to rely on the electricity from windmills, you're going to need this thing. And all right, let me tell you how you get your hands on this guy. It's real easy. You just go to mypatriotsupply.com/Rob. That is mypatriotsupply.com/Rob. And that's how you claim your free panels today. If there was ever a time to get serious about your energy needs and make sure that you're prepared for a blackout, or if you want to live naked in the woods, mypatriotsupply.com/Rob, mypatriotsupply.com/Rob. Get yours today, and let's get back into it. I do have a question for you on what you were saying earlier, that we largely lost manufacturing in this country because of inflation. And maybe this is just a dumb question, but it is on my mind. I was under kind of the opinion that, the racket of inflating currencies was kind of all the federal, basically all the feds were doing it. Europe's doing it. And in China, they seem to want to keep their currency from appreciating. And so I thought that they were I assumed that process was them just printing money as well. So how did we lose our competitive advantage, I guess, in wage rates against other countries if they've also kind of been inflating in lockstep? Have we just been inflating at that much higher of a rate than they are? Or am I just very off in my thinking here?
I think that's an excellent point. And first of all, if they had not reciprocated, and that is started printing their currency in tandem with the Fed, then the logical thing that the textbooks always said, that Milton Friedman said way back in 1971 when he convinced Nixon to, dump the gold standard in the Bretton Woods system, which was fixed exchange rates. What was supposed to happen is that those trade surpluses would lead to some significant appreciation of their currencies. And as a result of that, our exports would increase, our imports would decline, and you would have what they used to call a settlement mechanism in the global economy. Under the gold standard, you had that. If your trade deficit got too big, you had a huge outflow of reserve assets, which was gold, or in some periods, the dollar became under the dollar gold exchange system. But there was a clearance, there was a settlement process. You couldn't run big deficits indefinitely without large financial outflows, a tightening of credit in the domestic economy, rising interest rates, a sort of break on the excess demand and inflationary pressures underway. Well, after 1971, all of that settlement mechanism ended. And when the Fed then went overboard in 1987 and beyond with what I call Greenspanian Keynesian money printing, the rest of the world printed money, but not quite as fast as we did, but enough to keep their exchange rates from significantly appreciating. So there was no correction to the process. There was no settlement. We just kept running deficits, and they kept printing money slightly lower than our rate in order to keep their exchange rates from soaring and their exports from being clobbered. So you had a very dysfunctional system. We printed, they printed. Our costs rose faster than theirs. We lost manufacturing. We lost good middle-class jobs. That's why we got the idiocy of Biden. Biden was basically a blue-collar union mentality. He wanted it back, the way he thought it was in the 1950s, but he forgot or didn't understand that would never happen again because the Fed had inflated us, out of the global economy and out of competitive status. So you have a good point, but the mechanism was broken, and unless we basically have a huge house cleaning at the Fed and get them out of day-to-day intervention in the market and fiddling with interest rates, let the market find the right 10-year yield, the right 30-year yield, the right 3-month yield, the right spreads between various levels of risk in blue chip government securities versus junk bonds. None of that needs.
We can't buy our own debt at cheap rates if we allow for that. So who's going to fund
now
our
we
government?
I agree with that, but we have the stupid thing yesterday of the Treasury Secretary crowing that he's going to buy back 20 or 30 billion worth of government debt over the next couple weeks, I guess, or month. Well, what the hell is he talking about? What is he buying back debt with? Uncle Sam is broke. We're running a $2.5 trillion current account, so to speak, deficit on the federal accounts right now. We got to borrow that money. The only thing he's doing is issuing more bills and buying in longer dated bonds. What the hell is the point of that? That is the dumbest thing you could do, because if you push this growing, ballooning debt closer and closer to zero maturities, bills, 90 days or 1 year or even 2 years, you're setting the federal government up for a debt service, calamity that's beyond belief. Because at some point, the Fed, I think, has already lost control of the money market. You can't just keep flooding the money market and keeping interest rates close to zero where it did for years and years, because there's too much inflation now at loose in the system. So if you get to the point where the central banks can no longer suppress the money market rate, and you have a Treasury Secretary, a Wall Street guy even, pushing all of Uncle Sam's debt into the front end of the market, you're asking for a calamity, because all of a sudden, one of these days, money market rates will soar, and you're going to be financing, which will soon be the 40 trillion federal debt in the money market, in the 90-day bill market. I mean, you're asking for a calamity. And yet that's what this guy is doing. And he's telling Trump, see, we're really smart. We're doing a business-like thing. We're buying in the debt. Well, buying in stock was never a great idea either if you were borrowing money to do it in the private sector, which is another whole issue that we can get to another time. But for a totally bankrupt, red ink drenched Uncle Sam federal government to be buying in its own debt with new debt of a shorter maturity, is maybe symbolic of the utter flaws, of the utter catastrophe of Trumponomics.
All right, so I do want to come back to a little bit more of the tariffs and migrant labor, but while we're on the topic of the Fed's money borrowing, when do you think that happens that they can no longer rig the game and continue to keep the interest rate in the 4 to 5% range? When does it happen where the picture kind of breaks that there isn't that much demand for U.S. debt, that the price tag starts going up on servicing our debt? And then what happens from there? Are you looking at a jack up in the interest rate? Everyone floods back to bonds away from the stock market and some sort of a deflationary environment? And how does the Fed crawl their way out of it? So I guess the step one would be, in your opinion, how much more running room does the system have until interest rates have to go higher? And then what is the effect of that?
Well, that's really a good question, but I think the answer is it's already happened. The pivot point was March 2022, when the Fed finally cried uncle and said, oh, we were wrong. It wasn't transitory after all, the inflation. They shut down the printing press and pivoted to QT, quantitative tightening, unloading some of this massive $9 trillion balance sheet that they had accumulated, most of it since the crisis of 2006. So they have not printed any new money since March 2022. They have actually dumped into the market about 2 trillion of their holdings at the peak in, as I say, March 2022. So the Fed is out of the rigging business, because if you're, you can't just ex cathedra pronounce interest rates should be, 3% or 5% or 4%, whatever their target at the moment is for the month. That cannot be done through pure command, okay? It can only be done through the machinery of supply and demand. And if the Fed is no longer taking supply out of the market at huge rates, as it was prior to March 2022, it was buying 120 billion a month of treasury paper and GSE, which is, a near substitute for treasury paper, out of the market. Well, to hear some of the fanboys in the financial markets pretend that this is just sort of a normal life and that the Fed didn't have its finger on the scale, is really beyond belief. Because if you're buying 120 billion worth of Fed government paper a month, that is sure as hell affecting the price of the bonds, of the notes, of the bills, and therefore the supply and demand balance. Now, where I'm going with this is that the Fed and the other major central banks are out of the business. Even the Bank of Japan, which is even far crazier than the Fed. And you know what they've done, they had interest rates but nominally below zero, and in real terms below zero for decades. Even they have had to reverse course, and you can see what's happened to the 30-year and the 40-year Japanese government debt. The yields have just exploded because they're actually being forced to retire some of the massive holdings of government debt that they have, rather than continue to accumulate. So this isn't just the Fed. This is the EU. This is the Bank of Japan, and all the lesser fry around the world are in the same boat. So as we go forward and the politicians continue to pretend that we're in the same environment that we were in for 35 years after 1987, where the central banks became the government debt buyers of last resort, where the central banks together had their big fat thumbs on the scale in the market, thereby creating falsely low yields and falsely high prices for government debt. That whole era is behind us, and yet the politicians haven't caught up with the reality. Trump hasn't caught up with the reality. Speaker Johnson hasn't caught up with the reality. Thune, the leader in the Senate, doesn't get it. And certainly the Democrats are hopeless anyway. But what they don't get is that we're in a market where you keep flooding the financial system with government debt at a 2 trillion, 3 trillion rate or even more, which could happen even under this so-called big, beautiful bill. You're in a different environment because there is no central bank at the ready to absorb the excess paper and keep yields in a sub-economic zone. That's where we're heading right now. And I think once this big, beautiful bill blows up and the world sees that there is no fiscal policy at all in the United States, that we're running on automatic pilot, I doubt whether they can raise the debt ceiling outside of this. So we're going to have a debt crisis over and over again. They're not going to be able to pass appropriations bills because everybody's going to be so mad, and there's going to be, the Republican Party in the House and the Senate is going to line up in a circle and, have some kind of political firing squad as they blame each other. The rhinos and the, hardcore conservatives blame each other. You're going to have, pardon the French, a total shit show in the Congress in Washington when it comes to the basic matter of, running the government, of spending, taxing, and borrowing money. And I think, it's going to be a huge shock to the system. And then I think a good thing's happening. For the wrong reasons, Trump is attacking, and he did again this morning, attacking the Fed. And that's a good thing, because we need to understand the Fed is the culprit. The Fed has been the great enabler that allowed the politicians to go for years and years and decades, running a unsustainable free lunch fiscal policy because they falsely suppressed interest rates. Now, I think I have a little expertise about this because I was there in the 70s. I was a member of Congress, and of course in the Reagan administration. And in those days, politicians feared the deficit, feared borrowing too much, feared letting things get too far out of balance, because they knew it would show up in interest rates back in the hometown district. Car dealers would find they couldn't finance their inventory on the lot because rates were 15% or 20%. Manufacturers couldn't borrow because the long-term rate was double digits, etc. So there was a feedback mechanism that told politicians, you better square it up. You better put the brakes on the spending and the borrowing because the interest rates are killing us. Now, that mechanism was destroyed by Alan Greenspan and his heirs and assigns when they went into the big-time government market intervention business, debt monetization business that took the Fed's balance sheet. This is kind of probably pretty hard for people to realize, but you got to go back in history. You got to have some framework here. When we were, trying to, and we were successful, convince Reagan that he's got to let Volcker do what's needed to remedy this double-digit inflation. And Reagan went along. He was a hard money man. He was at heart a gold standard guy. When we were doing that, the balance sheet of the Fed was $200 billion. Okay, and just recently it peaked 2 years ago at $9 trillion. That's what happened over that 40-year period. Just massive printing of money, and that's just the Fed account. If you take all the other central banks, We probably went from a $500 billion central bank balance sheet in 1980 to somewhere in the 50 trillion range eventually. So we're now in an environment where the politicians still think they're in the world of massive monetization when the central banks are actually out of business. And as a result, the law of supply and demand is going to come back into force. It wasn't abolished, it was only suspended, by this era of central bank money printing, really, credit printing. And now we're going to, return to supply and demand. And I think it's too late to reverse course, because there is no basis anywhere in Washington with this bull in the china shop in the Oval Office and this hardened partisanship on Capitol Hill and this 20, 30-year experience that the deficit is a problem someday, but not now. Given all of that, Washington is totally disabled. It is dysfunctional. It is non-functional on the fundamentals of fiscal policy, and it has no central bank backup to bail it out. Well, that's where we are right now. And you can't say, well, I hear these Wall Street, economists and experts say, well, I remember in 1993, the yield was, 6.2%. And the next thing we knew, Greenspan did the following. We got down to 4.7 or something. That's all irrelevant. This is terra incognito. This is totally unexplored waters that we're in now. And it's very hard to predict where it'll go, but it certainly can't be good if you have this much government paper being generated every day and a decision-making system, a governance process totally paralyzed. And it will be completely and totally paralyzed, I think, within weeks and certainly months.
Wow. All right. So I have to ask, firstly, I love a president who would criticize the Fed, but when you're criticizing the Fed that the interest rate is too high, I don't know that that's the right criticism of the Fed, but I guess it is fun to go, hey, the Fed is mismanaging it, and that's the problem, even if you have the absolute wrong picture of what the fix would be. I'm curious, though, so I guess in that view, the Fed is out of room. They can't go back and start quantitative easing again if things start to break. So why do you think that, I guess, in the next couple months that this is now the breaking point, that the Fed, I guess, can't re-engage in bailouts or quantitative easing or resave the system? And once that signal, I guess, starts coming through that, hey, the Fed will not just be able to step in and artificially keep the interest rate low, do you think we're going back to like the what Volcker? What did it hop up to 18% at some point or something like that?
Yeah. I mean, the the prime rate, so-called, hit 20%, but the 10-year, which is the 10-year Treasury, which is the fulcrum security, pushed up into the 15 to 16% yield zone right in the late 1980, 1981. So now I think we're in an environment where we will suddenly learn that during this era of aggressive money printing by the Fed and all the other central banks, they actually had some helpers on Wall Street, London, in the financial markets of the world. And that is, all the smart guys were buying what they thought the central bank would be buying next month, next quarter, next year. They were essentially front running the central banks, because the central banks had the stupid view that we need to be transparent. We don't want to surprise you. We want to tell you exactly what we're doing. And there was this whole theory of central banking that this was enlightenment. This was, this is the way we could talk the market into going in the direction that, in their wisdom, the 12 members of the Open Market Committee thought was important. But that was dumb as hell, because it gave speculators on leverage an opportunity to front run, buy what the Fed was buying, knowing that they could capture the yield, that the price was going to go up, not down, and they could leverage the paper they were buying, 95 cents on the dollar. So it was like a printing press. It was like, Christmas day after day for speculators in the debt markets. Now, the point that needs to be understood is that helped the central banks suppress yields and prop up prices of debt instruments even more than would have been the case purely from the dollar to dollar intervention of the central banks. But what comes around goes around, as the saying goes. And it is pretty obvious that once the fast money, the smart guys down in the bond pits, realize that the central banks are out of dry powder, and they're not going to be engaging in large scale bond buying, they're going to start front running the other way. They're going to start front running declining prices and rising yield. And so the little helper that the central banks had over the period since 1987 is now going to be kind of a saboteur as they struggle with the environment we're in today. And once the fast money starts selling the bond, it's Katie bar the door, because on the margin, they're all on leverage. They want to get out of a losing arbitrage. And once they start selling, then sort of normal investors, banks, pension funds, insurance companies are going to get really nervous about the embedded losses in their portfolio. And they'll come up with all kinds of reasons why they need to lighten the load. And as they lighten the load, that is by selling the debt instruments that are going down, it'll only compound the downward crescendo. So these markets are not healthy. They have been rigged. They have been wrecked. They have been distorted by decades of central bank intervention and falsification of prices. And that has created all kinds of bad behavior, leverage speculation and debt, companies issuing debt to buy back their stock, thereby increasing their implicit and explicit leverage. All of these things are the consequence of not allowing honest financial markets. That is the law of supply and demand. That is, let the tens of millions of participants negotiate it out, in the bond pits and the stock pits day after day, without guidance and without the heavy thumb of the central banks. That's the only way the markets stay healthy. These markets are brittle. These markets are fragile. And all of the bad stuff that accumulated during those decades of central bank dominance are really the monsters that we're going to face in the decades ahead.
All right, so I want to hit you with one last question. Before I do, let's take a second and do some plugs. I know that you've got the Substack Contra Corner, which I read. I think you put out about 3 a week, if I'm about right on that. And you've also got a number of other books, but I'll hand it to you if there's anything you'd like to plug.
Oh, I think the main thing is this is moving so fast that you almost have to follow it by the day, and that's what I do. So my Substack, which is called David Stockman's Contra Corner, actually comes out every day. I might
maybe
miss
I missed a couple.
one.
I got to go back in my inbox.
Yeah, maybe it's too much for anybody to read, but right now there's so much going on, and what I try to do is put things in historical context. The world didn't start yesterday. What the central banks have been doing in the last while would have considered total heresy, nonsense, and even destructive 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's important to have some kind of framework so that the day-to-day back and forth can be interpreted and understood. And that's really what I try to do.
I love it because the books are so dense, and so getting the email, which is a couple pages, and I can read it, daily or the 3-4 times a week I'm seeing it. It's very digestible, and it's also so on point with what's happening right now. And you do such a great job of using the AI tools like the Twitter and just really pulling the real stats and kind of debunking what you're hearing, which is why I love it as a reader. For me, for plugs, I got an upcoming headline gig out in Las Vegas. I'm a stand-up comedian by trade. As much as I love these conversations and being as informed as possible, I do sling some jokes. So I'm headlining out in Las Vegas. You can find that at the Wise Guys Comedy Club. And then I've got my own tour going on. It's called Porch Tour, where I do shows from fans' backyards. You can find all those gigs at porchtour.com. I've got a long weekend out west, including Sandpoint, Idaho, Portland, San Jose, Reno, and then I'm opening up for Dave Smith out in Salt Lake City. All right, so let's delve in. I got one last question for you. For the American firsters out there who are all concerned with America first, can you give us the pitch for why the migrant labor is actually important to the U.S. economy? Why everyone, because I've seen, you've written on this quite a bit about, I guess, how reliant we are on some of the cheaper labor that comes over the border and how foolish we've been in basically making it that the only way that you can come here and do a job that a company would like you to have is by sneaking over the border. And you've had a very practical solution of basically using the consulate system or our embassies. But I'm curious if you could kind of give the breakdown on why the average American, I guess if you walk into a restaurant, you walk into a hotel, or you've got your guys doing the construction on a project on your house and you see people from South America, you shouldn't be yelling, hey, that should be an American job. If you could just kind of give the pitch of why it's a win for the U.S. economy if we had more migrant labor.
Okay, one, you're dealing with an iron law of demographics. The baby boom peaked in 1962. The birth rate, the fertility rate went down, relentlessly until by the end of the century, the 20th century, we were actually barely at the replacement rate or below. So workers weren't being born in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and the 2000s. And therefore, they're not, by that I mean native-born new workers, and so they're not showing up in the labor force as we go forward. And the evidence for that is, if you look at since 2018, 90% of the growth in total employment in the United States has been from foreign-born workers. And it's not because, well, there is a huge problem with welfare, and we're probably losing several millions of headcounts that should be in the workforce, collecting their food stamps and Medicaid and the rest of it. But even if you factor that in, there is very little growth in what are entry-level jobs. And it's not just manufacturing. In fact, it's the opposite of manufacturing. It's construction. It's in the food service industries. It's in the, chicken processing plants and so forth. There's no labor available. And so therefore, historically, half of economic growth has been from more labor hours, the other half from higher productivity. But we're at the point where without immigration of entry-level workers, you can't get labor hour growth. Their hours aren't there. And economic growth will therefore fall substantially, even as the native-born population retires, the baby boom retires, and we're heading from 67 million on Social Security today to 100 million by mid-century. So we're in a real demographic dilemma. That's the first point. The second point is we have a stupid immigration control policy. I'm not saying open borders, let everybody in. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying we bring in several 100,000 a year of immigrants who either qualify under family reunification or under some of the skilled labor categories, PhDs in technology industry, coders and so forth. But when it comes to basic work that you're talking about in your backyard or in the restaurant or at the construction site, the only place that you're going to get entry-level workers on the margins through immigration. So why do we have an immigration policy that only allows 10,000 immigrants a year under the low skill category? That's a drop in the bucket. It's nothing. Now, if we raised that quota to, let's say, 300,000 a year or 500,000 a year, people could go to the embassy or the consulate in their own country, apply for a green card for this new quota of low-skill workers, be vetted by the experts that we have in every embassy and consulate in the world. And, I think we have somewhat like 200 different facilities. And people who qualified, who weren't criminals, who didn't just walk out of a mental institution, as Trump keeps saying, or in some other way socially undesirables, they would get vetted, they would get their green card, and rather than having these criminal mules bring them across the border at very high prices, they could buy a ticket on JetBlue, and with their green card in hand, they could go to Kansas City and start working at the construction site that needs the labor. And that would dry up entirely this crazy nonsense at the border, because all those people are there not because some criminal cartel sent them. They're there because they want to work in the United States, and they can't get in under a employment quota, green card. So they have to pretend that they're asylum seekers, cross the border, because you can't even become an asylee, asylum. You're not qualified for asylum unless you come across the border and break the law and get arrested. I mean, this is the dumbest, most dysfunctional, idiotic system you could imagine. And yet both parties pretend it's the other party's fault. So rather than just open up the quota for low skill, bolster the resources in the embassies and consulates a little bit, send people who want to come here to work to 50, 60 different consulates and sites in Central America, Mexico, in South America, and elsewhere, the problem would end. And the real criminals who try to sneak through the border, I think, could be pretty easily handled by the Border Patrol because, the number of people that you would have to cope with would be reduced by 95%. So that's just pro-market rationality. But what Trump is doing is basically turning this into a political weapon. And the idea that when you have the idea of ICE raiding workplaces, it tells you that the whole thing is nonsense. Because in theory, these are all bad people and they're here freeloading on America, and you hear all this baloney. Well, if that's the case, you should be raiding mom's basement, because that's where they would all be hiding, not chicken processing plants on the midnight shift, and this is exactly what we're doing. So the whole thing is upside down. In other words, Trumponomics is upside down, 180 degrees wrong on imports, on immigration, on monetary policy, and on fiscal policy. Now, if you're wrong on two of the four or one of the four, okay, you might get a passing grade. If you're completely wrong on the four legs, let's say, of kind of macro policy, then there's real trouble. And that's about exactly where we are.
I'm going to get in one more question at the buzzer here.
Okay.
On the topic, and this might give away the answer, but I think there's some Americans conceptually who they like the idea of, well, let's have higher prices and have those jobs go to American workers. So while independently, I guess every single person on a construction project, if they got a guy who they think is good and they give them the lowest price, or the lowest price that they think represents quality work, that's who they'll go with. And they're probably not asking questions, hey, are the actual workers they're going to be coming over here, are they Mexicans or are they Americans? They're not asking that question because they're more interested in, hey, can I afford this project, and do I think the contractor selling me is going to do quality work? And so I think, I'm not into government price controls or government interfering in the market, but I think for some of these individuals, the argument is, hey, we need government to step in and kind of, because everyone's making a decision just around price, we need government to step in and say, no, these jobs have to go to Americans first, which also you run into the problem of, you're going to end up with more automation at some price points. And obviously, I don't even agree with the minimum wage law. But for people that kind of conceptually think they would prefer higher prices and to get rid of the migrant workers so that more of these jobs can go for Americans, are there even that many unemployed Americans who are looking for work to fill these positions? Are those Americans even willing to take those positions? Or is like the economic growth kind of having cheaper labor in these positions a net win for the economy, that it creates other opportunities for Americans? I guess that's kind of a long-winded question.
It's a really good question. But the people who say that, I hope either they have a rich uncle who's going to die soon so they can get an inheritance to live off from, or they have a government job, because prices will go up substantially if you go 100% domestic route. You'll get a reset of the price structure, and the standard of living for most people will decline as a result of that. There's nothing that can beat the free market, and that's the free market in labor, as well as the free market in business, as well as the free market in money. So yeah, you could have, this is called autarky, and actually it was a policy advocated by John Maynard Keynes in 1931 as a way for England to get out of the emerging Great Depression. It was nonsense. He said we need a preference for homespun goods. Now that sounds kind of old-fashioned, but it was a symbolic way of saying, I don't care if it costs more, I want it made in British textile mills. That's always been wrong, first of all, economically. And second, America went the other way. We had wide open labor markets throughout the late 19th century through 1925, and somewhat open markets after that. And we grew enormously as a result of the labor markets that function. So if you want to go to autarky and you're liberty-minded, you're conflicted, because to have real autarky means you want a powerful government saying which imports can come in, which can't, at what price. You have a powerful government saying what labor is available and what isn't, and implicitly at a higher price. It's all one big ballooning of the state. It's one big, crushing of liberty and free market opportunity that I think is the right way to go.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This was an absolute pleasure. I've been wanting to do this since I read The Great Deformation years back, and it's an honor to have you here, and that Zero Hedge gave me the opportunity. So thank you so much. All right.
Great.
And
good to be with you.
Absolutely. And just a quick announcement, the show will be on a more regular schedule at the moment, still figuring out what we're going to be doing with it. There will definitely be other interviews with noteworthy individuals such as David Stockman, along with some recaps of articles on the main page. But that is it for today. And next episode is with Mike Shedlock, who's another economist, I believe a friend of yours as well. And looking forward to that. That will be later in the week. All right. Thank you, everybody.